Clara Whitfield, 40 years old, housewife, wife of a man who was more shadow than spouse these days, stood at the threshold with a glass of water in her hand. She had meant to deliver it to Ben, the builder who'd been working on the cabinets all morning, but she lingered in the doorway instead. Ben wasn't conventionally handsome. His hair was cropped too close to his head, his hands were calloused and scarred, his shirt clung with sweat to a broad back. But there was something in the way he moved, slow, deliberate, unhurried, that made Clara pause. She told herself it was only politeness when she finally stepped in. "You must be dying of thirst," she said. Her voice cracked just slightly. Ben looked up, wiped a streak of dust from his brow, and smiled. A real smile. Not the practiced, absent-minded curve her husband always gave when she asked about his day, but something unguarded, disarming. He took the glass, drank deeply, and for a moment their fingers brushed. That was how it began. Not with a decision, not with intent, just with the smallest accident of touch. Clara's husband, Richard, was gone again. He'd left before dawn for another business trip, muttering something about a new contract in a neighboring city. He always left, always vanished into trains and hotels, into meetings and dinners, returning only to sleep and start again. Clara was used to the silence by now. Used to the stillness of the evenings, the meals cooked for one, the empty bed. She had told herself for years that it was fine, that she had chosen this life, that this was stability. But sometimes, in the quiet, her hands would tremble for no reason at all, as if her body knew something her mind refused to admit. That day, when she brought Ben another glass of water, she stayed longer. Watched the muscles of his forearm flex as he screwed a hinge into place. Listened to the faint rasp of his breath. He glanced at her once, twice, then held the look just a moment too long. Something in the air changed. They didn't speak of it. They didn't have to. When his hand brushed hers again, this time intentionally, Clara didn't pull away. When she leaned against the counter to steady herself, he stepped closer. The silence cracked open, and once it did, there was no turning back. The affair, if one could already call it that, might have remained a secret had it not been for Mark. Mark was another builder on the crew, younger than Ben by a few years, quicker with his tools, quicker with his words. He had sharp eyes that noticed things others missed. He noticed, for example, how Clara began appearing in the kitchen more often when Ben worked. How her cheeks flushed red when she handed him tea. How Ben's voice dropped lower when speaking to her. One afternoon, Mark returned to the house earlier than scheduled to fetch a tool he had forgotten. He stepped inside quietly, boots muffled on the dust-covered floor. He didn't expect to see anyone. The crew had left hours ago. But the voices drew him to the back of the house. Soft voices, too close, too intimate. He should have walked away. Should have left and pretended he heard nothing. But curiosity, dark, insistent, pulled him forward. And when he saw them, he understood everything. Clara and Ben. Together. The shock was sharp, almost electric, followed quickly by something else, a hunger he hadn't anticipated. A desire not just to expose them, but to join them. To taste the same forbidden fruit. He didn't confront them then. Not immediately. He waited. Watched. Kept the knowledge like a blade tucked under his sleeve, waiting for the right moment to draw it. The right moment came a week later. Richard was away again, as always. The house smelled of paint and wood glue. Clara moved through it with a kind of restless energy, as if every creak of the floorboard reminded her of her secret. That afternoon, when Ben slipped into the back room to meet her, Mark followed. "You two really think no one notices?" Mark said, his voice low, almost amused. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching the way Clara froze, the way Ben tensed like a cornered animal. Clara's lips parted, but no sound came. Mark's smile was thin. "Relax. I'm not going to tell anyone. But secrets like these, they get heavy. Hard to carry alone." He let the silence stretch, then added, "Maybe I could help lighten the load." The implication was unmistakable. Clara's cheeks burned with shame, with fear, with something else she couldn't name. Ben's eyes darted between them, torn between anger and hesitation. But in the end, it was Clara who made the choice. Or maybe she had already made it long before, when she first let the silence crack open. The triangle was formed. From then on, the meetings multiplied. At first they were reckless, stolen minutes in the unfinished corners of the house, shadows pressed together where the dust still hung thick. But soon that wasn't enough. The secrecy, the danger, became part of the allure. They found hotel rooms on the outskirts of town, where no one would recognize them. A cheap motel with flickering neon signs, a grander inn with carpets that smelled faintly of mildew. They met in garages, where the smell of oil and rust mixed with their breath. They even once stole an hour in a park after dark, hidden behind thick oaks while the world slept. Every encounter deepened the web. Every lie Clara told her husband, about errands, about friends, about headaches, pulled her further into the labyrinth. She told herself she was alive again, that she had been suffocating for years and now she could finally breathe. But always, beneath the thrill, there was fear. Fear that someone would see. Fear that the fragile walls of secrecy would collapse. Fear that Richard, cold and distant though he was, would come home too soon. Richard Whitfield was not a man of passion. He was a man of plans, of ledgers and contracts, of long drives across cities to secure deals that Clara never fully understood. But he was not a fool. He noticed, in quiet ways, that Clara had changed. Her eyes shone differently, her voice carried a new tremor. She seemed distracted, evasive. She had excuses ready before he even asked questions. Richard's business trips grew longer, but his mind often returned home. Suspicion coiled in him, subtle at first, then sharper with each phone call that went unanswered, each vague explanation that failed to ring true. One evening, as he sat alone in a hotel dining room miles away, Richard found himself staring at his untouched plate, a thought gnawing at him. She's hiding something. The seed was planted. And seeds like that, once planted, never stop growing. For Clara, the affair became both escape and prison. She laughed more, smiled more, felt younger than she had in years when she was with Ben and Mark. But when she was alone, when she lay awake in the vast bed Richard had left empty, guilt clawed at her ribs. Sometimes she imagined confessing, telling Richard everything, daring him to leave her, to free her. But she knew him too well. Richard wasn't a man who left. He was a man who endured. And when endurance broke, it turned to something far darker. So she kept silent, kept lying, kept meeting in the hidden corners of the world, always a step ahead of discovery, or so she thought. What Clara didn't know was that Richard's next trip home wouldn't be like the others. He would return earlier than planned. And when he walked through that door, he wouldn't find the house empty. He would find everything. Richard arrived home earlier than planned, the tires of his car crunching against the gravel drive in the gray hours of late afternoon. The house stood quiet in the fading light, its windows reflecting the last streaks of day. He sat in the car longer than he needed to, gripping the wheel, listening to the tick of the cooling engine. He hadn't called Clara to tell her he was coming. Something inside him resisted the idea, an instinct he couldn't quite name. Better to appear unannounced, to let the truth show itself without warning. When he finally stepped inside, he noticed first the silence. Not the usual silence of an empty home, but a muffled, stifled kind. The kind of silence that hides something. His suitcase thudded softly against the floor. He didn't call out her name. Instead, he moved through the hallway with careful steps, every sense sharpened. It was the faint sound that gave them away. A low, muffled voice, Clara's voice, drifting from upstairs. Another sound followed, rougher, male. Then another. Two of them. Richard froze. His heart hammered once, then steadied, falling into an unnaturally calm rhythm. He climbed the stairs without a sound, his hand brushing the banister as though grounding himself. The door to the bedroom, their bedroom, was half closed. A faint glow spilled from the crack. He pushed it open. Inside, Clara was tangled in sheets with the two men he had seen working in his house not long ago, their bodies entwined, the air thick with the scent of sweat and betrayal. For a moment, none of them noticed him. Then Clara's eyes flicked upward and met his. The color drained from her face. The room went still. Ben's hand froze mid-motion. Mark swore under his breath, springing upright, But too late, Richard had already seen it all. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. He only stood there, his face unreadable, his eyes moving over each of them in turn. Clara opened her mouth, a whisper spilling out. "Richard, I—" He shut the door quietly and walked away. Clara stumbled after him, fumbling for her robe, calling his name in a broken voice. But by the time she reached the hallway, Richard was gone, the sound of the front door slamming echoing like a gunshot through the house. She sank to her knees, trembling. Ben and Mark hovered uselessly behind her, whispering apologies, assurances, promises that meant nothing. The damage was done. Richard drove without direction that night, the dark highway stretching endlessly before him. His mind replayed the scene in fragments. Clara's wide, guilty eyes, the builder's startled faces, the way his home, his sanctuary, had become a stage for betrayal. Rage simmered under his skin, but it was a cold rage, controlled, patient. He stopped at a gas station hours later, staring at his reflection in the dirty restroom mirror. His face looked the same as always, but his eyes were different, harder, sharper. He realized then that he had no intention of confronting Clara with words, no interest in demanding explanations. Explanations were useless. What he wanted was balance. Retribution. Something deeper than divorce or abandonment. Over the next days, Richard pretended nothing had changed. He returned to the house with a weary smile, kissed Clara on the cheek, asked about her errands. She answered with forced calm, relief trembling beneath every word, as if she believed he had chosen to forget what he'd seen. But Richard was watching her more closely than ever. Every glance at her phone, every unexplained absence, every nervous twitch of her hands became another piece of the puzzle. He began following her. At first discreetly, then with growing obsession. He watched as she left the house on afternoons she claimed were spent shopping, only to see her car parked near a shabby motel on the edge of town. He saw Ben and Mark arrive minutes later, their careless laughter as they disappeared inside with her. Richard kept his distance, always in the shadows, always silent. He noted the license plates of their trucks, the names stitched into their uniforms, the patterns of their movements. He collected details the way other men might collect coins, methodically, obsessively. Clara remained oblivious. She had convinced herself, perhaps, that his silence was forgiveness, that the storm had passed. But Richard's silence was not forgiveness. It was calculation. One evening, he returned home to find her humming softly in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup. She turned to him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, asking about his day. He kissed her cheek, sat at the table, and answered as though nothing was wrong. Inside, he was already planning. He thought of the builders, of Ben's steady hands, of Mark's sharp grin. He thought of the way they had looked at his wife, the way she had looked back at them. He thought of his bed, defiled. His house, corrupted. His name, stained. And as Clara served him his meal, as the steam rose between them, Richard decided that when the time came, there would be no mercy. Richard no longer felt like a man. He felt like a shadow, moving through the rooms of his home unseen, unheard, while watching everything. Clara thought she had regained control of their fragile life, that the silence meant forgiveness, that he had closed his eyes and turned away from the ugliness he had witnessed. But Richard's eyes were open wider than ever, and they missed nothing. The strange part was how calm he felt. In the first hours after he discovered Clara with the builders, fury had threatened to break through his skin, to consume him entirely. But now, as the days stretched into weeks, that fire cooled into something sharper, something more dangerous. He no longer wanted to scream. He wanted to plan. Each night, when Clara slipped into bed beside him, when her breathing grew steady with sleep, Richard stared at the ceiling and thought. He thought of how betrayal wasn't just an act, it was an infection. It had spread through his marriage, his home, his dignity, leaving rot where there had once been trust. And like any infection, it needed to be cut out. He began with small things. Clara didn't notice when he slipped into her phone, memorizing her passcode after watching over her shoulder. She didn't notice when he copied the names and numbers of Ben and Mark. She didn't notice when he checked her messages in the middle of the night, reading every hurried word, every arrangement of their secret meetings. The motel was their favorite. Room 6, tucked away in the corner, far from prying eyes. They believed it was safe. Richard drove there one afternoon and sat in his car across the street, watching the comings and goings. He saw Ben arrive first, saw Clara minutes later, saw Mark not long after. They disappeared inside, the curtains drawn tight, the door locked against the world. Richard's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. He didn't follow. Not yet. Patience, he told himself. Timing was everything. He returned again and again, building a map of their habits. Tuesdays, Thursdays, sometimes Saturdays. Always the same room, always the same careful pattern. It was routine now, their secret lives threaded into the hours Richard was supposed to be away. They had become predictable. Predictability was weakness. Richard began speaking to people. Not about Clara. Not directly. But he asked the motel clerk questions, casual, friendly, offering a folded bill to loosen the man's tongue. He learned the way the locks worked, how easily spare keys could be made, which hours the staff changed shifts. He learned the exits, the parking lot's blind spots, the broken security camera that hadn't worked in months. At home, he played the role of husband perfectly. He asked Clara about her errands, about her friends, about her day. He made her laugh at dinner, poured her wine, pretended to drift back into comfort. And Clara, relieved, clung to the illusion. She believed she had been forgiven. She believed the storm had passed. But sometimes, when she thought he wasn't watching, guilt flickered across her face. She looked away too quickly, spoke too fast, avoided his gaze for just a second too long. Richard catalogued every glance, every twitch. The mask she wore might have convinced others, but it could never convince him. One evening, Richard found himself alone in the garage, staring at his tools. The hammers, the wrenches, the saws. Instruments of building, of repair. But in his mind, they became something else, symbols of destruction, of reckoning. He imagined the sound of them in use not on wood or metal, but on flesh. The thought didn't disturb him. It steadied him. But he wasn't careless. Reckless revenge was for fools. Richard wanted precision. He wanted them to feel the way he had felt, cornered, exposed, helpless. He wanted them to understand what it meant to destroy a life, to ruin a man from the inside out. He started leaving hints for Clara, subtle enough that she could dismiss them, sharp enough to gnaw at her subconscious. A faint perfume on his collar that wasn't hers. A receipt from a bar she'd never heard of, left where she might find it. The shadow of suspicion, planted deliberately. He wanted her to feel unsteady, unsure, the way he had felt. She grew restless. He saw it in the way she watched him from across the table, searching his face for clues. She asked once if something was wrong, her voice careful, trembling. Richard only smiled and kissed her forehead. "Everything's fine," he said. She didn't believe him. Ben and Mark remained oblivious. They thought of him as the absent husband, the man too wrapped in his work to notice his own wife slipping away. They didn't see the way Richard lingered in the background, didn't sense the predator circling closer each day. On a damp Thursday evening, Richard followed them again. He parked far down the street from the motel, his car swallowed by the shadows of a broken streetlight. Rain slicked the pavement, turning the neon glow of the motel sign into a smear of blood-red light. He watched as Clara arrived first this time, her coat pulled tight, her face hidden beneath the brim of an umbrella. Minutes later, Ben's truck rumbled into the lot, followed by Mark's smaller car. They slipped inside room 6, the door shutting quickly behind them. Richard sat in silence, listening to the rain on his windshield, his pulse steady. He reached into his coat pocket and touched the cold metal of the key he had acquired from the clerk days before. He turned it over in his fingers, the weight of it grounding him. Not yet. But soon. He drove away that night, leaving them to their indulgence. But in his mind, he saw the room clearly, the arrangement of the furniture, the placement of the lamps, the narrow bathroom door. He saw it like a blueprint, every angle, every corner etched into memory. When he returned home, Clara was already there, pretending to fold laundry, her hair still damp from a shower. She looked up at him with forced casualness, asked about his day. Richard smiled, kissed her cheek, and told her it was long. She relaxed, relief washing over her. He almost laughed at how easy it was. But inside, Richard's resolve hardened. He no longer doubted what had to be done. The time for watching was ending. The time for acting was coming. He didn't yet know the precise shape his revenge would take, but he knew this, it would be final. 4 weeks, they had stolen from him, his trust, his pride, his marriage. Soon, he would take something from them in return, something they could never replace. And when the night came, Richard swore to himself, they wouldn't see it coming. The night Richard chose for it was ordinary on the surface. A soft drizzle slicked the streets, the kind of weather that made most people hurry home, huddling in coats and umbrellas. Ordinary nights were best for extraordinary deeds. No one looked too closely, no one remembered details. He had waited long enough. Clara thought he had another trip. She kissed him goodbye that morning with relief in her eyes, relief that she would have the house, and her freedom, to herself. Richard played his part perfectly, suitcase in hand, smile faint and tired. He watched her from the car window as he drove away, her figure shrinking into the gray drizzle. But he did not leave town. Instead, he parked near the motel, as he had done many times before, waiting in the shadows of the lot. He watched her arrive, slipping quickly from her car to room 6. Ben came minutes later, his heavy boots splashing water as he jogged under the neon sign. Mark was last, grinning, careless as always. The door shut behind them, and the curtains drew tight. Richard waited. Patience had always been his strength. He let the rain fall harder, let the hour grow late. He could imagine them inside, the laughter, the whispered words, the reckless joy of betrayal. He imagined it until it no longer made his stomach twist, until it only hardened his resolve. When the motel clerk's shift ended, Richard moved. He slipped from his car, the stolen key heavy in his pocket, his steps silent on the wet pavement. The rain muffled sound. The thunder rolled low in the distance. It was as though the night itself conspired to cover him. At the door to room 6, he paused. From inside came muffled voices, laughter. He slid the key into the lock and turned it slowly, silently. The click of the tumbler's opening was drowned by a roll of thunder. He pushed the door open. The first to notice him was Clara. Her smile froze, her laughter dying on her lips. She sat up, her hand flying to her mouth, eyes wide with horror. Ben and Mark turned too late, their bodies still tangled in careless abandon. For a heartbeat, the room was silent, the three of them staring at Richard as if he were some apparition, something pulled from their worst nightmare. But Richard was no ghost. He was flesh, blood, and fury contained within iron restraint. He shut the door behind him, sliding the lock into place with deliberate calm. In his other hand, the glint of steel caught the dim motel light, a hammer, heavy, familiar, drawn from his garage. "Richard," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. He said nothing. Words were meaningless now. Ben rose first, stepping forward as if to defend, but hesitation slowed him. In that half-second of doubt, Richard struck. The hammer swung with brutal force, connecting with a sickening crunch. Ben's eyes went wide as he collapsed, blood blooming across the cheap carpet. Mark lunged then, shouting, but Richard was ready. He moved with a precision born of calculation, every motion planned 100 times in his mind. The hammer fell again and again, until Mark's cries dissolved into wet silence. His body twitched once, then lay still beside Ben's. Clara screamed. She scrambled backward against the headboard, hands clutching the sheets as though they could protect her. Tears streaked her face, her voice breaking as she pleaded. "Please, Richard, please don't." He looked at her. For a moment, his hands stilled, his breath steady. He remembered their wedding, the vows, the life they had built. He remembered the quiet dinners, the laughter they once shared. He remembered everything he had lost. Then he stepped forward. Clara tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The room was small, the door locked, the windows sealed. Richard cornered her as easily as a hunter corners prey. She fell to her knees, hands raised in a useless shield. "I'm sorry," she cried, the words tearing from her throat. "I'm sorry, Richard." But apologies meant nothing now. The hammer fell one final time, silencing her pleas. When it was done, Richard stood in the center of the room, chest heaving, the sound of rain and thunder pressing against the thin walls. Blood stained his hands, his shirt, the carpet. 3 bodies lay crumpled around him. Their betrayal ended in crimson. He felt no triumph, no joy. Only emptiness. But emptiness was better than the festering infection that had lived inside him. It was over. Richard set the hammer down carefully on the nightstand, as though placing a tool back where it belonged. He unlocked the door and stepped into the storm, the rain washing the blood from his skin. He didn't look back. The neon sign buzzed overhead, its light flickering on the wet pavement like a warning no one had heeded. Room 6 stood silent now, its curtains drawn, its secrets sealed in darkness. Richard disappeared into the night. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and like this video for more true crime video. Don't forget to leave your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. Take care and see you in the next video.